I'm going to start just welcoming the guests and the students, because this seminar was organized by Carlo Botrugno within a course of the University of Florence, which is the course of Politics and of Globalization and Human Rights. So today we are going to speak about bioethics and racism. And the title of our meeting is Racism and Technological Innovation in Healthcare. We have very special guests here with us, so I'm very happy to welcome them. And I think that it will be a very interesting opportunity for the students as well. So I'm going to give the floor to Carlo, who is the organizer of this meeting, and the students can stay until 5:20 as planned, or they can stay until the end of the meeting as they wish. Okay, thank you very much for being here and welcome to everyone.
Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Carlo Botrugno, the coordinator of the research unit on everyday bioethics and the ethics of science at l'Altro Diritto Research Center at the University of Florence. I'm very pleased to give start to this second edition of the Bioethics in Action seminar series, which is dedicated, of course, to bioethics and racism. Before to start, very few words on why we are here, why the rebels have organized this seminar series. We started to conceive this initiative a few days after the killing of George Floyd in the United States on 25th of May 2020 by Altman of the Minnesota Police Department. Those images have shocked the world, have raised a lot of protests worldwide, and in some sense we believe something has changed after that event, because also in bioethics there has been a strong call for action. Bioethics is today required to give its contribution to unveil hidden or non-explicit forms of racism and discrimination, and therefore to struggle for equality and social justice.
So, forse un po', we hear you, but it's a bit, you should be louder, I think, maybe.
Well, now, maybe better? Better or not?
E prova a parlare un po' più a lungo.
Un po' più a lungo?
Speak more than we, okay. Then I can tell you if it's better.
And therefore, here we are with 4 seminars and international speakers who have been carefully selected to contribute with their views, with their research experience, and with their thoughts. I would like to give a special thanks and welcome to our speakers of today, Robin Pierce, Suzi, Camey, and Inês Faria. Robin Pierce is Associate Professor of Health Law and Regulation and leads the research group on health and technology at TILT, the Technology Institute for Law and Society at Tilburg University. Her research addresses the legal, the ethical, and policy issues regarding emerging health technologies, including genetics and AI. She has extensive experience in various aspects of ethics in health and medicine. Professor Suzi Camey is professor at Statistics Department and Epidemiology Graduate Program of the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. She's also head at the Biostatistics Unit of Clinical Hospital of Porto Alegre, and her research focuses on statistical methods applied to epidemiology. Inês Faria is a member of the REBES, first of all, but also an anthropologist and researcher at Socius ISEG at the University of Lisbon. Her research interests are related to medical anthropology, African studies, health and development, science and technology, and sociology of economics and the organization. So thanks to all of you for being here with us. I will immediately start by giving the floor to Robin Pierce, who will talk about bias in technological innovation in healthcare, pursuing commitment to change it practice. Professor Pierce, I'm giving the floor.
L'ho già dato il ruolo, Carlo.
Ah, okay. You have the floor, Professor.
Your microphone is not active.
And now, can you hear me? Okay, great. So yes, I wanted to say that it is a pleasure to be here, but it's also an honor, I think, more importantly, to participate in this very important initiative. And I thank you tremendously, both in principle and for the invitation to address the students and so forth. So share screen. Okay, let's see if this works. Yeah. Okay, so my talk, I never know what to do with the, my talk today is about racism, bias, and technological innovation in healthcare. I am going to use the term racism as this is being used in the health disparities literature. I want to say just a few words about my approach to the talk today. It's not going to be a recitation of different technologies and their racially differential impacts. I think we've all seen some of those. I will make reference to some examples. But rather more importantly for me is to try to situate the role of technological innovation in health disparities, to explore conceptual approaches to the role of innovative technology in health disparities, explore and consider complementary approaches to developing effective interventions and the research needed. So to do that, we need to consider pathways and mechanisms. And as I said in my abstract, I'm looking always at how can we address this? How can we make this better? And some initial thoughts about what an agenda might include. So definitions of racism are offered by some of the leading scholars in health disparities. According to a paper written by David Williams and colleague, racism is an organized social system in which the dominant racial group, based on an ideology of inferiority, ranks people into social groups called races and use that power to devalue, disempower, differentially allocate valued societal resources and opportunity. A word that you may have seen a lot more lately in the past few years is structural racism. And according to a 2017 article by Bailey and colleagues, including Mary Bassett, structural racism refers to the totality of ways in which society fosters racial discrimination. And this sort of looks more towards the mutually reinforcing systems, racism in housing, racism in education, employment, earnings, employment conditions, credit, healthcare, criminal justice. Yeah? Criminal justice and so forth. And one of the critical features of this is that they each reinforce the other and affect the distribution of resources and opportunities. So when we look at the cause of health disparities, as you know, health disparities have been documented for decades, many decades. We try to untangle what exactly is the root of these health disparities. Well, one of the things that we're doing is looking at it conceptually, foundational reasons those reasons, according to Lieberson, that are critical causal factors that generate an outcome. So according to Williams in his 1997 paper, racism is a fundamental cause of racial inequities in health. And he has on repeated occasions proven that, shown that. By contrast, surface factors are those that are associated with the outcomes, but there's no causal connections. Changes here don't necessarily result in changes to the outcome. Another aspect of this, which I alluded to earlier, is the multidimensionality of the causes of racism as a cause of health disparities. So when we look at structural racism, which Williams has recently referred to as the process of embedded laws, policies, societal practices that advantage one group over another, oppressing, disadvantaging, neglecting the considered, those racial groups that are considered inferior. In addition to this, basically unpacking the definition used by Bailey and colleagues, there's cultural racism, which is an embedding of an ideology of inferiority. And we get this in values, symbols, imagery, media. There's sort of an ideological environment. The idea being that if you live in a particular environment, that you will soak it up by osmosis. And we've seen that it's very difficult for someone who grows up in a society where racism is prevalent and pervasive and not soak it up in some extent. This is also where we get the implicit and explicit biases. So what are the implications for technological innovation in healthcare? So that's the question of the day. Yes? Okay. So why explore the question of racism and technological innovation? Well, it presents a pathway that can affect and result in differential outcomes, racial inequalities, for example. So if racism is considered a fundamental cause of adverse health outcomes for racial minorities and for outcomes regarding racial inequalities, then what do we do about it? David Williams has gone on so far as to say that there is a striking persistence of racial and ethnic inequities in health, and the empirical evidence that indicates that it's SES alone simply do not account for the racial disparities that we see. Many people talk about SCS, socioeconomic factors, being the real operative factor in the disparities. And that it can be indeed true, particularly when we look in the international context, but in the US context, we seem to be understanding even more that we're looking at a situation of racism as a fundamental cause. So we've got this trajectory of racism resulting in adverse effects on health. So the question basically is, what is the role of technology? So the role of technology in healthcare is such a complex question. It's enormously beneficial in many ways. It rides a wave of promises. When we have healthcare innovation, there's an enormous fanfare typically. For example, the Human Genome Project, it's hard to imagine a scientific initiative that was met with more excitement and promise. Genetics, genomics, the science that was going to transform healthcare. ICU, life-sustaining technologies. We're looking at some of those now with ventilators, et cetera. Technology-facilitated diagnoses, PET scans, MRIs, digital diagnoses. And of course, AI in healthcare is now heralded as being transformative in healthcare. So even though we may sort of expect these benefits, hope for these benefits, and indeed some are delivered, as we're seeing now in these very difficult times, the benefits often are not distributed evenly. and in some cases can even act as a double-edged sword for minority groups. That is, not only do they not share equally in the benefits of the technology, but it may actually have a deleterious effect on them. So I'm going to take us on a stroll down memory lane, so to speak, to an article written by Grande and Yarasmuni in 2008, Technological Innovation and Inequality in Health, in which they looked at education and then found that more educated individuals have a greater survival advantage in those diseases for which there has been more health-related technological progress. Basically saying the more technological progress there is, the more the wider the gap between those who are educated and those who are less educated. Not a good direction. Similarly, a study found in 2005, looking at statins, the introduction of statins, that improvements in productivity of healthcare disproportionately benefit the heaviest healthcare users. Those are the richer patients. This suggests, according to these researchers, that by making more diseases treatable, reducing the price of healthcare even, improving healthcare productivity, you can actually widen socioeconomic disparities in health. The exception to this rule, they note, is the simplifying technologies, the technologies that make, for example, a medical regimen less complex. In 2006, Cutler and Deaton and Yarasmuni made a prediction that there would be an acceleration in the production of new technologies in the coming years. Corder looked back on this, and partially based on this and looking forward, medical technology actually poses a particular challenge to the threat of rising relative inequalities in health. Thus, for conditions where the new interventions are effective, technological progress may actually result in increasing health inequalities. Ironically so. We have an example: cancer survival disparities for most racial and ethnic minority populations widen as cancer becomes more amenable to medical intervention. That is essentially saying when we just have a medical intervention for a disease like cancer, somehow the introduction and use and integration of that technology results in greater disparities. So let's fast forward to more recently. There was a scoping review article by Weiss and colleagues in which they looked at the period of from 1996 to 2014, I believe, in which they looked at all of the papers that looked at technology and impact on health inequalities. They discovered that individuals of higher SES were the first to adopt, and those who benefited most from the introduction of innovative technologies in health, thus creating social inequalities in health where there were once very low or non-existent. Let me say that again a little bit more smoothly. That the introduction of health technologies were first adopted by wealthier individuals. Wealthier individuals benefited most, and this introduction actually resulted in the creation of social inequalities in health. Furthermore, in some cases, even inverting these inequalities, meaning that where there were improved health outcomes among the lower SES groups, it now went to the higher SES groups. So in some ways, one could conclude from the scoping review, the results from the scoping review, that technological innovation actually may not be good for racial minorities. So how does this happen? Is it design? Is it cost? Is it some other access? Is it use? The indications for the use of these technologies? I would speculate that it's probably all of the above and more. Why? Can we answer the question, does technology co-produce or perpetuate racial inequalities? This is an empirical question. So we need to look at whether technology or how technology is an instrument of structural and cultural racism. But as a pathway, as a means by which racism may be co-produced, perpetuated, and contribute, and as such contributes to continued racial inequality at health. So I wanted to look at the sort of spectrum of the possible ways that technology may actually contribute to this, to perpetuate racism, health disparities. So as Williams and colleagues have pointed out, racism can be a causative factor in technology to the extent that it perpetuates or co-creates this, may also be a causative factor. May be a contributing factor. Once it's on the market and adopted and integrated, access to it becomes important and plays a role in the widening or lessening of health disparities. It's a perpetuating factor. Are we looking at norms that carry over from what was previously done by humans, now done by technology? One example of this that I'm looking at now is the use of e-alerts. Well, if the data is derived from electronic health records and the abundance of data in electronic health records comes from the people who go to the hospital more, then we've got perhaps some kind of biased data source that is merely replicated when used and input into e-alerts. Facilitating factors, something like platforms. So I wrote an article, was a co-author in an article on social media to recruit clinical participants. That is a platform that is not equally accessible, not equally used, and may actually have negative implications for certain groups. So let's take a look at the healthcare innovation cycle, because I want to get to the pathways and mechanisms. And this sort of follows the standard route of enabling technologies, proof of principle, best practices, standard of care, etc. We sometimes think of this as translational research. I liked this one from Simmet that starts with clinical need, and I'm going to challenge that, as you might imagine, idea, proof of concept, feasibility, and so forth. We know this, those of us who do translational work in bioethics, as the translational pathway, where we start with fundamental research, preclinical, clinical research, translation to practice, and translation to community. So I mentioned I commented on the unmet needs, starting with the need. Well, is that always the case when there is a technology developed and presented to the healthcare system? Well, sometimes it's not. And we have to ask questions of resource allocation, priority setting, agenda setting. To what extent is high-tech hype and hope? And to what extent, and I want to emphasize this, is it aligned with needs? So I want to give an example of what I think is a paradigmatic disease in so many ways, what it illustrates about how we approach diseases where there is no cure or the options for treatment are so slight, but it has an extremely high prevalence. 58% of all people living with dementia live in low to middle income countries. Number will rise to 68%. There are approximately 3.2 There's a new case of dementia approximately every 3.2 seconds, with a total of approximately 10 million new cases of dementia per year. But if you look at the interventions, even though these are being pursued in research, there seems to be a fair marginalization of the low-cost interventions: lifestyle, aerobic, exercise, cardiovascular health, and social interaction. And among the things that we know with some certainty that is actually effective in delaying the progression of Alzheimer's is aerobic exercise and social interaction. We're still working on the pharmaceutical intervention. And here's just a clip. So when we talk about high-tech and developing high-tech interventions for dementia or Alzheimer's, this is what the comparison looks like. High-income countries, low to middle-income countries. Are we really addressing an unmet need? This is a fairly old, and you can see updated versions of it. The point of this is to show the progression of Alzheimer's disease and when we can discover it, sort of the early detection phenomenon. And we can discover it when you start to see symptoms. It's around this time period. But using these high-tech, these technological interventions, we can use like amyloid PET scans, cerebral spinal fluid, MRI, cognitive, and then we have the cognitive impairment. But these are all technology-intensive diagnoses. A student in my class today gave a presentation on digital biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease, where we have people carrying around a smartphone that will identify less discernible changes, digital changes that are associated with Alzheimer's. So we have to ask the question, what are the trade-offs? Who is disadvantaged in these trade-offs? But let's look at the reality, what we know about health disparities in Alzheimer's disease. Non-Hispanic Blacks, this is in the US, had roughly double the risk of underdiagnosis as non-Hispanic whites. This is underdiagnosis. Here in Denmark, it was observed in 2018 that there is a worrying difference in access to anti-dementia treatment and care for dementia patients who have an immigrant background as compared with Danish-born population, even though there are similar levels of adherence. What's going on there? And in the Netherlands, MCI and dementia were 3 to 4 times more prevalent in non-Western immigrant groups when compared to the native Dutch population. Non-whites, this is the US, are 4.3 percentage points less likely than whites to receive special dementia care. And this was people in nursing homes. And the reason that was given in this study is that the special dementia care was not available in the hospitals, the nursing homes where non-whites resided. So the pathways and mechanisms are multifaceted. Sometimes they're direct and sometimes they're indirect. So we're looking at sometimes the clinical encounters, diagnoses, treatment, care, pain relief. Yes? No. Resource allocation issues, alignment with needs, and indirect pathways where technological contributions to structural racism or facilitation of cultural racism. And there's a particular study that was done by Williamson just last year about structural racism, that it contributed to, clearly, residential segregation. And that we know, as a result of his work, that residential segregation results in poorer health outcomes and thus contributes to health disparities. So when we learn that AI systems are selectively showing either employment ads or housing ads or rental ads to people based on proxies for race, we see how technology can actually enter this trajectory. So who, what, where, when, how, what do we do about it? So the timing, where in this trajectory, this translational pathway, do we intervene? What type of interventions? Which modalities of regulation? And regulation meaning broadly meant influencing behavior. So if we understand that regulation refers to channeling behavior, getting people to behave in a certain way, here, getting people to behave in a certain way with regard to technology that reduces health inequalities, then we have to look at what are our options here. Lessig talks about 4 modalities: law, the explicit mandates that we are all familiar with, markets, the use of economic incentives and disincentives, social norms, and code or architecture, the physical and technical constraints on activities. So, for example, if we're looking at fundamentals, yes?
Professor, these are just participants joining, so it beeps.
Okay,
sorry for that.
Thank you.
Ignore
No problem. I just didn't want to miss a communication. So if we're looking at fundamental research, what can we do at the fundamental research stage? I'm using this as a shameless pitch for my Genetics and Society Working Group that has recently, well, actually, a year or two ago, launched a project on fighting scientific racism. And we have written several articles together, basically addressing, attempting to dismantle notions in the fundamental research. This one attempting to provide education for people studying genetics to disabuse them of connections, the notions of connections between genetics and a real concept of race. And these others basically looking at the translation of genetics information to communities. So what can we do with it? Well, the idea of a gene for violence or a gene for aggression, et cetera, criminal behavior needs to be addressed directly, such that the technology is not misused and abused. Other examples: fundamental research, the design by privacy by design, which is very common. We can talk about fairness by design. We're seeing a lot more of that in the introduction of AI in a number of domains. Clinical research, the recruitment methods that are used, the justifications for the racial and ethnic composition of the study sample, translation to practice, looking at issues like regulatory approval. Is there some way to involve these kinds of considerations at that stage? Public engagement, the voices of the community, and more careful attention to access-related aspects of implementation and standard of care. But what about when technology discriminates? And we rarely think of that. It's always a human behind it. Well, there's this distinction I want to make here is distinguishing technology as an instrument, a tool, from technology as an actual perpetrator. And when we start to look at the integration and adoption of automated decision-making that refine decisions based on additional inputs that are separate from the initial input, then we may start to consider technology having an oppressive impact. And then, of course, its ability to create new categories through various types of machine learning. So what does this suggest? Well, it suggests that there is a sub-agenda for looking at technological innovation in healthcare and health disparities. What role does technology play in the fundamental causes? Many of us look to social change as the way to eliminate health disparities, as a way to eliminate structural racism, which has been identified as contributing, responsible for a substantial amount of health disparities. But we also must look at conduits, technology, as a conduit? Is it causative? When is it causative? When is it contributing? When is it perpetuating? When is it facilitating? Through this, the idea is that we can identify more opportunities for intervention in the life cycle of technological innovation. So as we look forward, and we see that, the increasing digitalization and a variety of technological advances, it requires a tremendous amount of scrutiny, and it's not just for safety, but also for its deleterious social effects, for its impact on racial equality and racial inequality. And so when we talk about CRISPR, which is, garnering headlines, and we've got gene editing, and the International Commission just presented their initial report on initial use focus on monogenetic diseases, which makes sense, risks, and they talk about the risk, the off-target effects. We have to attend to not only the scientific risk, but what are the social risks? Some of this we've been through before, the spillover use, the misuse, the sequelae of social sequelae of genetically editing phenotype, particularly in the human heritable genome. So with the increased digitalization of medical information, the role of technology in healthcare can be expected to increase. And as Weiss observed and colleagues observed, as the quantification of health intensifies and innovative technologies become the cornerstone of this transition, the connection between technology and health is garnering increased attention. It's not just attention that it needs scrutiny. What is the basis for and trigger for meaningful interventions? So as we scale up, meaning that we embrace more and more digital technologies, as the interfaces with other data streams increase, will we be exacerbating, perpetuating, and compounding inequality? And where in the technological innovation trajectory can we make that turn a different direction? My closing observations. Health disparities persist despite a long recognition and documentation. As William said, there is a striking persistence in health disparities. The role of technology is increasingly recognized, and that role can only be expected to increase as we digitalize. As we have observed in numerous studies, technology can actually result in creating social inequalities in health, even where they did not exist before. So when we look at technology as a conduit, we have to ask questions like, what are the technological pathways that are contributing to and perpetuating health disparities? Can these technological pathways be harnessed to beneficial effect in reducing disparities? And what do evidence-based interventions for disparities work in health technology innovation even look like? There's a lot of work to be done. And given the introduction that Carlo made about what happened with George Floyd, I think it's in all of our interests to do that work, to join in doing that work. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor. It was a very interesting and enriching presentation, the best presentation possible for opening our seminar session, our seminar series. And you made reference to one of the point of reference of the seminar series, which is also genetics and biomedical research, which will be the object of the next meeting. So it was wonderful. Yeah, there are some people laughing. So I will leave the discussion at the end, and before to give the floor to Professor Camey, I will ask everybody to mute your microphone because there is some noises. And yes, it's the turn of Professor Camey, who will talk about the disparity between Black and white people in COVID-19 number. Professor Camey, you have the floor.
So I would like to start to thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to talk about this. It's not my research field, but I'm very concerned with this subject. So I want just to give to you a glimpse of what I found about these disparities. Carlo, I cannot share my screen. Okay.
Did you find it?
Yeah.
He did, Carlo, yes.
So as a statistician, I'm always looking for answers in numbers. So it's always almost a joke for me. I always trying to see the numbers and what they mean. So when we are talking about COVID-19, it's mandatory to see these huge numbers. It's an amount of people infected, and the deaths of caused by COVID-19, it's very huge. And we need to start to look at these numbers, because day by day there are a lot of people dying, and we are just accommodate with this situation. It's normal that thousands of people are dying, so we need to look this number and see how huge they are. We have more than 120 million people infected. We are more than 20 million people infected now, and we have more than 2.6 people that dies with this disease. So we need to see also that the government management impact in the numbers of COVID-19. We can see huge difference in these numbers country by country. So, for example, unfortunately, my country is the worst example of this. Brazilian population represents 2.7% of world population, but now we represent 10.5% of COVID-19 deaths. It's a very big difference. This is not normal. This have a closer relationship with the government management. Because we can say, oh, but Brazilian is a developing country, and there is a lot of poor people here, so could be normal that this happens. But if you look, for example, India, it's totally different. They take into account 70.7% of world population, and now less than 6% of deaths. So there is a relationship between what the governments are doing, are saying, and what are happening with the population. And another way to see this is compare the COVID deaths in the last 12 months with the last burden cases of disease that our world data turn public for us. So if we compare this with the deaths in 2017, COVID-19 is in the 7th place. It's huge. It's very big. If you displace overcome tuberculosis in the 90s, AIDS in the 2000s, so it's huge. It's a disease that is taking lives of a very big amount of people. But again, if you saw this in Brazil, COVID-19 is the second place. It's just losing this place for cardiovascular disease. And again, if you compare with India, it's the 15th place. And for our target, our world example to management of COVID-19, if you saw New Zealand, if you see New Zealand, we can see that it is only the 19th place. So we have to think about these actions governments have a huge influence in the COVID-19's numbers. But to talk about the racial perspective, I will use two examples, USA and Brazil. First of all, there is, at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of research started to write papers talking about the need for data and special care for Black population since the beginning. And as we are saying, we need data about this, and this data is not always available, as you can see, for example, in the USA. They launched an initiative, a website to track the data about race and ethnicity. And the first aim of them is the public deserves the most complete data available about COVID-19 in the US. No official source is provided. So we are. So everybody knows that we need this kind of data to point out the difference, but unfortunately, in the US and the same in Brazil, these data are not available. They have a statement that they know that COVID-19 is affecting Black, Indigenous, Latins, and other people of color the most, but we need more and more standardized data to truly understand the impact of these communities and to mitigate those disparities. So we need data to show that these numbers are different, and we need this data to try to mitigate those disparities. So it's incredible that nowadays we are still fighting for data. We are still fighting for this kind of information. Unfortunately, this project was ended 2 weeks ago. The data are still available there, but they are not collecting more data. At the final statement that this people said is states are not reporting any data about the race of a third of COVID-19 cases in the US. A third of COVID cases are not, there is no information about these people. So we don't know if they are Black people, Latin people, we don't know nothing about it, 1/3 of this case. And the more concerning is that nowadays they started the huge campaign to vaccinate people, but there is no reporting about race or ethnicity of this data. So it's a problem, and it still is a problem. But even with this, this lack of data about race, there is some very concerning results. This I took from CDC, and when we compare, we did a comparison between white people and other groups. The risk to be infected, to be hospitalized, or death is higher for the most of other groups. The only exception is Asian. But for example, American Indian or Alaska Native, they have 3.7 times to be hospitalized, Black people 2.9 times, and Hispanic 3.1 times. And it's the same for that. The risk is higher for this kind of groups. And they did also a study to measure the life expectancy at birth. And Black male, they already lost 3 years of life expectancy at birth because of COVID-19. And in comparison, white male, they lost less than 1 year. So it's clear that this pandemic, it's not the same for everybody. And we have two big problems. We don't have enough data to establish this. And it's clear that there is very, very huge difference. And with concerns of Brazil, we have a very nice paper published last year. The name, I think, is self-explanatory because they are just a point that this necropolitics that put Black people, Black community in more risk. In this timeline, they establish some important dates that something changed in Brazilian health system. In the 80s, they start to see that there is high mortality rates for Black people, but there is no national data there is no data in national service talking about the race. So they start to point out that they need to change this. They need to record race or ethnicity in Brazil. But it took 16 years to start to record the information about color in our national mortality system. We spent more 28 years to record the color information in national health systems forms. And in 2017, 30 years later, that they beginning to see that there is difference in mortality rates for Black people, the record of color icon and filling the field called race or color will be mandatory for professionals working in health service. So since 2017, it's mandatory to fill this kind of information in our health service. But at the beginning of the pandemic in Brazil, a lot of lawsuits were filed by Brazilian entities against the state, demanding the disclosure of epidemiological data not aggregated by race and color. So there was a lot of lawsuits filed just to try to obtain this information from the states. This paper points out that only 5 states in their epidemiological bulletins publish information about race and color. So in our national system, we have this information, but they are not publishing this information for their population. There is also another work that's trying to see the differences between regions in Brazil and ethnics, and they found that B Pardo and B Black are the most important risk factor after age. That is a greatest risk factor for COVID-19. After age, be Pardo and be Black are the most important risk factor for mortality in Brazil. And we can see this data I took from our websites in the last week. And we have in the first column the distribution of population according to color or race. And as you can see, we don't have a very marked difference for Black people or Pardo people, but we have to take care about one information. 21.6% of hospital admission doesn't have information about the color or race. This is huge. If you don't know if these people are Black or white or Pardo, we don't have certainty to say that all race is not related with hospital admission or that about COVID-19. But if you see the rate mortality between race, among the race, we can see that indigenous, Pardos, and Black in Brazil are dying more than white people. And there is also a big number of deaths in pregnant women in Brazil. And with concern of pregnant women, we can see that Pardo woman has more infection and they are dying more than white people. And this relationship, it's clear even with 20% of the information about color or race are not showing. So we needed to work in this direction. We needed to try to have better data about race, because if even with a lack of information, we can see some difference. We can imagine if all these people are Black or Pardo, this difference could be greater. To understand a little bit why we have these big numbers of unknown information. This health system is filled by health professionals in the hospitals. So could you imagine nowadays with this chaos that are in our hospital, this feeling is not so good. It's not proper as they could be. So this could be at random. I want to see with this that could be could have the same proportion of white people, indigenous, Pardo, and Black in those cases. But also we know that the chaos in the hospitals is worse in the hospitals that are public. So in these hospitals, most of the population are Black and Pardo. So we can imagine that a big proportion of these cases are cases of Black people and Pardo people. So this is what I want to say. I want to thanks for the organizers, because this is a very, very important matter. So we need to talk about this, and we need to more and more address these situations. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Camey. You provide us with a lot of information, very interesting data on, and we can understand now clearly the importance, the value of health data in this dramatic situation. We are all aware that Brazil is living COVID. The impact of COVID is really tremendous. So Brazil is among the countries suffering the most the impact, and for sure we need to collect as more information as possible to assess this impact. Before to give the floor to Inês, I would like to introduce Alice Doyeta, who is a professional illustrator, staying with us for all the 4 meetings. She is getting inspiration on our talks to make some sketches here. And she will show us her drawings at the end of the session. So stay with us until the end, please. So now I will give the floor to Inês Faria, who will talk about therapeutic navigation and assisted reproduction technologies in Mozambique. Dr. Faria, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone, and hello, Carlo. Thank you for organizing this and for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here because I think there were this series of coincidences that led me to this floor of discussion, which I think were very fortunate. Of course, I was sort of grasping with issues of racism and race and biotechnologies, especially regarding research in ARTs in Mozambique. But also I have been writing an article recently on more of a reflexive tone of doing fieldwork in anthropology and what it means to be an anthropologist from Portugal working in Mozambique or doing research in Mozambique and all that implicates and so on. And yes, I got comments from this reviewer that I don't know who is, that sort of caught my attention and reminded me that some things that I heard or some examples that I gave could be looked at from a different angle, and that really stood for these more institutionalized racist mechanisms. And what I'm trying to do here today is a little bit wrap my mind around this and share with you some of my thoughts and some aspects that I think are important of the Portuguese colonial legacy in Mozambique and in Portugal as well, and how I sort of grasped it in the trajectories and in the processes of accessing infertility treatment among the women and couples I came across. So I will try to share. Oh my Deus. Screen. Okay. No. Application window. Okay. Can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And okay. So this is the topic. This is part of the research I did for my PhD, which I finished in 2016. So I was working on the processes women and couples went through in the quest for fertility treatments when they could see they could not have children as a couple. And today, what I will try to talk about is what I found are several points that were relevant both in my research and in understanding the issues of reproduction, fertility, and infertility, but also while looking at racism and at racialization as a category or a dimension of to problematize current social and institutional, local and international practices that are related to the provision of biomedical technologies and access to those technologies. So here you can see a little bit of the theoretical background that I'm trying to use to think about these things. And I will start to talk a little bit of what was my empirical research. So it was pretty much a qualitative research. I did ethnography in Maputo, in the city. I interviewed 25 women and 2 doctors. And then parallel to these interviews, I did participant observation. I did this in clinical settings, so in 1 public hospital and 1 private clinic in Maputo, but also at some points when possible with women who had undergone ART treatments and their families. And in those more, I will get to this, but in those more intimate moments is where you could grasp some of the anxieties and talk a little bit about these subjects. I also visited South African private clinics close to the border because part of my respondents were looking for ARTs, which are state-of-the-art in South Africa, and there are several clinics located close to the Mozambican border. So that's where the ones who could went for treatment. Then the other ones who could went to the private clinic in Mozambique, which provided in vitro fertilization, but nothing else. And the majority of the women went to the public sector, where they could access only basic fertility consultation and diagnose, laparoscopic surgery, and also in some very specific cases, intrauterine insemination with fresh sperm. So this said, to this presentation, I sort of articulated this ethnographic experience, but also historical research about the Portuguese presence in Mozambique, and also comparisons with other research focused either on reproductive technologies and race and racism, but also on the specific region of Mozambique and South Africa. So, yes, also here in Portugal, I have been we have been talking more with about race and racism, and anti-racist movements are gladly gaining more traction and a better voicing overall, mostly because of the Black Lives Matters movement, but mostly in aspects that are connected to civil society. So there is not a lot of political talking or talk officially about these issues, but there is a lot of civil society talk and people discussing and finding and proposing ways to improve situations of representation, of economic inequalities, of spatial inequalities, of racialized people, of inequalities in access to health, which prevail. But here, as Robin defined or used the definition very well, we have this historically perpetuated problem of institutionalized or structural racism, which is not directly spoken about, which is not openly dealt with, and that was very present in our colonial practices and our colonial processes, but also is something that is sort of neglected. So there is this process, there is this book, which you can see there, which is called Casa Grande and Senzala. And it was published in 1933. By then we were present in Mozambique for long, but this is when this rhetoric that keeps, that has sort of occupied a certain public opinion in Portugal was appropriated, which is the idea of lusotropicalism, which carries the fantasy that our colonialism and our colonial regimes were kind of nice. So it sort of exempts the thinking about these colonial processes and decolonization processes as something violent, oppressive, racialized, that creates a very wide majority of subaltern people. And so we sort of, when this book appeared, we had a dictatorial regime called Estado Novo. And what happened in the beginning was that the ideas of this book, well, that could be interpreted in this book, were sort of rejected in the beginning because of the very sort of layered racial hierarchization, and the idea that this could foster practices or more practices of miscegenation to that this regime opposed. Then again, there was this reconfiguring of things that was sort of convenient, where there was sort of a semantic cleaning of the colonial practices and of what was happening and of all the violence. And there was the introduction of this concept of Lusotropicalism in propaganda, in the thinking about how nice our colonial occupation was, and that we mixed a lot with the people and so on, which left a space that is sort of a space of silence and a space of non-discussion, not only because this is a comforting idea, it sort of deblames politically a country of these issues, and it sort of creates a false escape to not deal with what happened. But it also creates these racisms made of microaggressions in everyday life that are hard to grasp and that are hard to identify, which I think happen not only here or in Mozambique, but in a lot of places. And so it creates this atmosphere where it's small things spread everywhere and embedded in a lot of ways of thinking and of doing things that are automatized, but that by not being spoken about are really not questioned and not circumvented and changed. So what I think, and this was very present in Mozambique. So in Mozambique, the colonial occupation, we did not have this outspoken apartheid regime that was politically bounded, but things happen again in a sort of everyday life matter. So there was space segregation, and Black people were delegated to the periphery of the city of Maputo. Then in the city center, you had white people. Then you had a mix of the ones who work in commerce and trade, who could be of Eastern origin or of Portuguese origin. But there was this spatial division, and there were other sorts of divisions and inequalities, but not imposed in a legal manner, but imposed in everyday life. Forms of oppression related to education, related to access to resources. And so what I think we can see today, both in Portugal, but also in Mozambique, is these effects of these long-term racialization processes in which race and skin color were instrumentalized as a form of oppression and distinction, but that has translated in this very embedded institutional racism that it is changing. There are changing. It's not the rule of law, and it's not something you see right up front, but that is there, and I think needs to be spoken about. And it also perpetuates these socioeconomic inequalities. So there are many factors at play here, and also in relation to health treatments, which are economical, which are related to class, which are related to the capacity or not for social mobility. And these things happened among my respondents, but still the majority of people lives in very unequal conditions, and the majority of women I met could not access these technologies that I will talk about. So one of the first episodes I want to talk about was some people I spoke to in different places when I was starting my research on the subject. And then I told a professor once that I never saw again that I was doing research about Mozambique and about infertility. And I got a response like, oh, Miss, please, how are you doing research on infertility in Mozambique? Infertility rates there are huge. If one thing, women have too many children there. So this was one aspect that I started to think about more recently, since I recalled this conversation. And I think there are two levels of inequality and of prejudice here, which are related to what I spoke about, so local, specific realities of inequality, but also more general rhetoricals that have effects at international levels that sort of use biased interpretations of course, women have the fertility rates are high, but so are the infertility rates. And what kind of choices do we have, and what kind of choices do my research respondents had, and who decides what kind of choices people have in different regions of the world? So I believe that you can somehow grasp these global inequalities in the production of health, in the distribution and provision of healthcare technologies, but also in the way you talk about it. And while where the reproductive rights of women in general and couples who cannot have children are sort of kept below the high fertility rates and the ideas of population control and economic development. So this was one of the aspects. Then I normally came across women who were not in a very happy situation because they wanted to have children. They could not have children with their current partner. And very often these women had children before, so there were cases of secondary infertility, which is often created by infections, by STDs, by lack of proper medical care, by unsafe abortions, and some other causes that can be also hormonal or mechanical. But nevertheless, they were in this interruption on their wish to make a family, on their life aspiration to make a family and to have a child with this new partner. And so adding to this, there were also some pressures that when you are in a couple, often people expect you to have children. And what happens is that when you cannot have children, a series of microtensions emerge, and there are the in-laws, and then women have to deal with a lot of pressure from the in-laws and sometimes from their husbands. And so there are these two kinds of pressure that are that women were bearing, which were related to the family structure and how they were dealing with these relational ties and how they were managing the infertility situation within these relationships, but also this lack of choice. So what choices did these women have? So some of them could only access the public sector, which gave them very little possibilities to actually bear a child. Others were accessing fertility treatments in South Africa, and even so, the success rates of fertility treatments with IVF or ICSI are not that high. And the other ones were accessing the fertility clinic in Maputo. So they were sort of managing their therapeutic itineraries, according to many aspects. So to the availability and access they could have depending on their social status and social class to these treatments, to the sites where these treatments are provided, to the fact that these kinds of technologies are mostly provided by the private sector, so they are marketed and they are priced with very high treatment rates and procedure rates. And so there were all these aspects that were being connected in their own trajectories, and that were very present in different ways in their treatments, in how women who could used ARTs. So yes, I think this somehow connects to these ideas of stratified reproduction that seem to be mostly triggered by economic factors, but that we cannot really tell for sure where these inequalities come from and the extent to which they are dependent on previous inequality regimes that were perpetuated. So there are, before I say this, these technologies, as I said, are mostly provided in the private sector, and they are a market. They are part of a market. But there are also some initiatives that aim to provide infertility treatment at a low cost or in a manner that more people can access it. For instance, the Walking Egg Foundation is an example of this, but they do not work in Mozambique so far, I think. And there are also other barriers for implementations of these kinds of treatment at the national health services, which in the case of Mozambique are also related to wider national health priorities, which prevail over infertility and reproductive issues. So these women had these choices between public and private healthcare, and there were these dynamics that are economic, that are related to their lifestyle and to the values and to the way in which their families were more conservative or putting more pressure on them, or a bit more open and a bit more accepting. And also the issues of provision related to power and to the global markets of biomedical technologies. What I wanted to talk about was this, yes. So once enrolled in treatment, once doing an ART cycle, what generally happened, as I spoke to women, is that you enter in this sort of mathematical means of, okay, you do this, now you get a consultation, you get a diagnosis, your husband comes, has a consultation, has a diagnosis, now you have to do the injections to have the hormonal stimulation, then you do egg retrieval, sperm retrieval, then you try to do the in vitro fertilization, and then it is implanted in you. This is sort of the timeline of treatment, which was demanding, and women had to go. Even I came across women from different backgrounds, even women who had economic power or more economic possibilities. They struggled to fund these treatments. So, especially when going to South Africa, but also in the private sector in Mozambique. So they had to go on long bus journeys to bordering towns. They did the treatment or the consultation, then they came back on the same day. So this way they would go at 3 a.m. and come back at 4 p.m. There were all these schedules for doing the injections. They had to do one of them in the bus back home. So there were all these choreographies going on within treatments, but also and in interaction with technologies. But there were also these choreographies going on inside the clinic, and where these various dimensions are present, even if not in a very direct manner. So political dimensions, legal dimensions, personal, emotional dimensions, relational dynamics with a husband, the aspiration to have a child, and what it means for a woman and a couple. And then, when effectively using ARTs, all these were sort of choreographed around these timings and these processes of treatment. And some issues arise, and these issues among the women I spoke to were particularly related to failed treatment. So what to do when the treatment using your eggs and your husband's sperm fails. Then these technologies pose new options, and I think this is where the questioning also begins. So what about relatedness? Will this child be related to me only? Or if if it is a sperm donor, or if it is an egg donor, will it be related only to my husband? What will be the consequences of this? When using donor gametes, sometimes women sort of pointed issues of, okay, I'm using donor gametes, but how can I do this? Then race comes into the talk. So I don't know the donor. Who will be the donor? Will his or her skin be too dark or too light? And so there were all these elements that these technologies brought for, and that for these people were doing treatments were important, because mostly the issue of being related to the child somehow genetically was a bit crucial. For instance, adoption was not a first option for the couples I came across. And this issue of being genetically similar to the parents, or at least in terms of color, was also mentioned 1 or 2 times. So not by everyone. Some people really did not see an issue in this aspect, but these were also questions that arose according to clinic bureaucracy, to clinical questions, to the questions that open up after you consider a certain possibility for treatment after a failed one. There was also a case of a couple who thought about using a surrogate. And again, this surrogate was a bit of a case of subalternity. So this was a family who was well off. And they thought about using this person, but they did not want someone they did not know. So they knew this woman who was very humble and who would be willing to do it for a certain amount. And so I think this is another layer of inequality and of bodily availability that is very much connected with some preconceptions, but also some structural disparities in terms of life, quality of life, and improving the quality of life for the surrogate, but also for this couple. So there was this negotiation there. And I think also these issues are connected to different levels and to different kinds of everyday life strategies. In my recent research, which is not related to ARTs, I also came across sort of marketing discourses which are related to developing countries and to developing friendly technology to developing countries, and to use these terrains as a place to test and to test and to implement and see if specific digital platforms work. Not related to health, mostly related to bureaucracy and land registration and so on.
Inês,
Think about.
sorry, we have to close in brief.
Oh, no, it's the last one. So I don't have answers to any of this. This was a bit of a reflection about my field experience and a bit of the stories of the women I met. And I think what I wanted to think about it is how, as a researcher, and how can research contribute to discuss these issues as we are doing here today, and I came across a couple of well, one special issue and one webinar that were really interesting, related to race and racism, and well, and one about anthropology and one about medicine, science, and technology. And yes, I think this is pretty much it. I hope it was not too confusing.
No, it was.
And I
very
think
clear.
I need to stop sharing. Yes.
Yeah. So
Okay.
thank you, Inês. Very stimulating presentation on your research experience. I would like to thanks all of the speakers for the presentation, which provide us a lot of insights. So I won't take about a few minutes just to make a comment on the basis of my research experience in the field of technological innovation. And after that, I will immediately open the discussion. Participants can intervene and submit questions to our speakers through our chat. So I would like to share this thought, given that over the past 10 years, I've been working on technological innovation in healthcare, assessing the ethical, the legal, and social aspects, especially for what concerns telemedicine, digital health, and generally speaking, the field of ICT in healthcare. I had the opportunity to make interviews, to talk with different people, professionals, patients, technology providers, stakeholders, and so on. So in my experience, as often as I open the box of the ethical issues, one of the most recurring answers was new technologies can be used for bad or for good. It just depends on how you use it. But I've always been skeptical about this, and I have to say, with time passing, I understood that my concerns were grounded on some literature. It refers particularly to science and technology studies, which have a very critical orientation toward the assessment of technological innovation processes. So far, I discovered that technological artifacts cannot be seen as value-free, discrete objects because their functioning, their design, their purpose, they serve just bring inscripted the social processes that contributed to their development. In other words, a number of features and also user groups were previously identified, selected, and prioritized also. Therefore, it is clear that the idea of neutrality of technology simply mirrors technological determinism, and therefore it must be rejected for several reasons. But from an ethical point of view, I will just mention that the fact that technological innovation has a cost for societies and has a cost for healthcare. So given that resources in generally speaking and in healthcare are not endless, we should carefully assess the processes of technological innovation which deserve to be pursued. But now I go to the point for this seminar, and I do ask our speakers, I would like to ask our speakers to make a comment on this. To me, it is quite obvious that the idea of neutrality of technology just promote a vision in which technological innovation is seen as something we cannot stop and we cannot avoid. But as a matter of fact, this vision is the best ground for commercial companies to sell their products. So in some sense, the neutrality of technology and determinism are a kind of capitalist vector. But I was wondering whether or not these ideas, these concepts are also part of a system of knowledge through which oppression, discrimination, and racism are perpetrated in our societies because they hide social processes and therefore also racist processes through which technologies are designed, funded, implemented, and used. I will make a brief round with our speakers, and I'm also collecting some other inputs for the discussion. Professor Pierce, want to make a comment on this?
Carlo, did you want to show the drawings by Alice or later?
I think maybe later, because I'm not sure she finished it already.
Yes, for me it's better if we do it later, so I can adjust the detail.
Perfect.
Yeah, thank you.
Professor Pierce, you have the microphone.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a really great question. What strikes me first when you mention technological determinism, and I'm happy to hear that you reject that. And whether or not this sort of commercially driven sense of technological determinism works to further oppression and perpetuate it. I think that's born partly out of a conflict of values and motivations. So just as the GDPR wants to protect individual data protection rights, it also wants to promote commercial and industry interests. And so we have these sort of conflicting these notions working at cross purposes in many instances, and we see that increasingly with newer and newer, and particularly digital technologies. So the extent to which this furthers oppression, I think, yes, I think it does, and here's why. If we look, and it has to do with the types of technological innovations we're seeing. If we look at these increasingly digitalized technologies, ones that are smarter, ones that basically collect data and operate statistically and then profile in various ways, however you call it, then to the extent that it's embedded in a racial societies that are steeped in racial hierarchies, it cannot help but contribute to and perpetuate racism, and obviously racism in healthcare. So yes, it's something that's worrying, and I see it as an increasingly concerning matter.
Thanks, Professor. Professor Camey, we are interested in your data scientist perspective.
Okay, thank you. As Dr. Priester mentioned before, AI are used to improve health systems and address health problems. But as I showed, there is a lot of lack of information about race in our health systems. So as she said, we are perpetrating this lack of information, these disparities, because all the system they are not made to address race issues. They are addressed to they are made thinking about there is no racism in the population, that everybody is equal, and it's not the truth. So if you just use this technology to address health issues, you continue in the same situation. You will not change anything. And I want to ask to Dr. Pierce if are you seeing that IT people concerned with this issue, because AI technology, they are it's pushed by IT people. And from my experience, they are not take care about this issue. They just want a bunch of data, and there is some result, and they are very happy with this result, and they are not worried if there is this kind of bias. Thank you.
That's a wonderful question. Just let Inês to give answer on the first round, and we come back to Professor Pierce. Inês.
What? Hi. I should answer a question?
If you want to make a comment on my comment, which was if technological innovation,
technological neutrality.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now I think pretty much everything has been said, and I also think that it's much more complex than only to be seen as a tool or as something that that can simply be adapted to different purposes that easily, especially because at least with digital technologies, and sort of departing from the work I'm currently done, there's always someone behind it. And in this case, there's always a developer behind the software and someone that is creating a software or a technological device with a certain set of values and moral principles behind. So yes, I think that there's a lot of space for discussion, but I think human bias is maybe there, but thank you.
Okay, Inês, thanks. So Professor Pierce, want to answer to the microphone?
Great. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. It's a dilemma that we've encountered with other new technologies, of course. And are they concerned? Are IT people concerned with these kinds of issues? Generally not. Like many of us, we're very focused on what our task is. And you've heard many IT people say that, well, this is objective. We make the automation operate neutrally. Well, that's simply not the case, as Virginia Eubank's excellent book on automating inequality showed. So it's not just a matter of use, it's also a matter of design. And so one of the things we look at, as I mentioned before, is education. Can we educate IT people? And we know from empirical data that only goes so far. Both with scientists, I've been involved in that, and with medical students. We figure if we can train medical students, we can educate them about racial and cultural sensibilities. When they go into the clinic, they'll behave in more racially and culturally sensitive ways. Well, sometimes they do, and sometimes exactly. And so when I think where I was that we have to look at the entire toolbox for effective interventions in achieving this goal of having technological innovation be more racially and culturally sensitive so that it doesn't contribute to and perpetuate racism through technology.
Thanks, Professor. Is anyone who want to address some questions and curiosity to our speakers? Or in the meantime, I will ask Alice if she's ready to share the drawings.
Yes.
Okay, fine.
So I'm waiting for the. Okay. I would like to just introduce myself. I'm an old soul, so I work with pen and paper, but you will receive digital version of the drawings as soon as I manage to get them on the computer. So just to tell you why I'm showing you a block. So this is the first part where Carlo explained what sparked this series of conferences and webinars.
Wait a minute. Maybe we can give the Lucia, we can give the Alice the role of speaker.
Yes, I did it. Yes, I did it, but she's just showing it on paper, so that's why.
Okay, it's not okay
Sorry.
to widen the screen.
Because it is a small screen, you see now. But maybe because I see your like Carlo, I see your face as the big one, like your screen is the bigger one, and then I have the smaller ones. So maybe
if you can change the layout, you can put focus,
exactly.
And then we can see you in the bigger screen.
Oh, I should change it? Should I change it or?
No. Each one of us.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Sorry, I've never used this platform before, so I'm not familiar with it. Can you also
go on, Alicia? Yeah, don't worry.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the first part. The talk Robin was giving about how new technologies can affect in both a good way or in a bad way the minorities, and how actually we can see that the more technological advances we have, the more social and racial disparities we have. You can see it in the graph here. Very scientifically accurate. And here is the part where she was wondering, like, what can we actually do about it? We have translational research or various approaches through law, and how sometimes technology can be racist itself. Can give different outcomes based on people's race. And then we've got Suzi, Camey's talk about how COVID-19 affected maybe like this, you can see it. Yes, how the situation in Brazil and the rest of the world, how minorities, different communities are affected in a different way by COVID-19. And then we've got Inês. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Inês. Yeah.
Yes, you are.
Okay. Talk about Mozambique and fertility treatments, and how lusotropicalism has affected the local view about fertility and infertility, and how the world also has a view about fertility rates in Africa, and how it is a very sensitive topic, and the different aspects a woman and a couple at when choosing to get a fertility treatment. And then we've got a big drawing of Carlo asking us and the speakers, is technology really neutral? Which is the final drawing and I made. Sorry if this was a bit not ideal with the screens and so on, but
thanks, Alicia. Don't worry, we will collect the digital version and we will share through our networks and maybe also on our website, so all participants will see your drawings. So thanks again. If there are no questions, I'm ready to close. I guess we can close.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you everybody for this wonderful first seminar. Thank you for your availability. Thanks to all participants and to the students of Lucia, which stay with us until the end. So Lucia, if you want to say something?
Thank you. I hope that the students will have the drawings as well. I think that they are
Okay.
interested.
Keep in
Thank
touch
you.
for the next seminar on 23rd in 1 week. We are looking forward to meeting you again. Bye. Ciao.
Bye. Ciao.